In a landscape as heavily saturated as horror, it's almost impossible to make something that doesn't feel derivative in one way or another, but that doesn't mean originality can't bleed through. The post-apocalyptic genre is one of the most trope-laden subgenres in horror, and it often feels like there's just nothing more to explore with the concept. But in 2018, we were treated to a take on the subgenre that actually felt fresh, and with a third entry on the horizon, I wanted to look back on John Krasinski's tension-filled and refreshing post-apocalyptic horror movie, A Quiet Place. Good evening. My name's Evan and welcome to Rocklin Graves. A Quiet Place is a movie that I regretfully missed out on when it first released, and it wasn't until like 2 or 3 years ago that I actually sat down and gave it a watch for the first time. The script was written by Brian Woods and Scott Beck back in 2016, and when John Krasinski was approached for the lead role, he liked the story and its thematic undertones so much that when he was meeting with the producers, he asked to co-write the film and take on the role as director as well as take the lead role, so his involvement with the movie goes very deep. Emily Blunt had read the script and was the one who'd initially suggested that Krasinski try and direct the film, and he'd written the mother character with her in mind, but as the couple had recently had a new baby, he didn't want to ask her to take on the role. After reading over his version of the script, Blunt wanted the role anyway, and there's something so wholesome about these two parents being drawn to the story over the strong protective instinct they have for their children. That's a really sweet backstory. With a budget of $17 million, the film released in 2018 and was basically praised all around, so I'm really just throwing my hat in on this one very late because now seemed like a good time to share my thoughts. Before that though, I want to thank my wonderful Patreon supporters and YouTube channel members. These videos take a lot of time and energy to make, and the extra support really helps to keep things moving. If you're interested in getting some bonus material and accessing private supporter-only polls or getting early access to the big videos, consider supporting me on either platform. The first thing that really sets A Quiet Place apart from other post-apocalyptic horror movies is that this isn't a movie about zombies or infected. We don't actually know much about the specifics behind what these things are or how they came to be, but they're creatures that hunt with their extremely sensitive hearing, and what I really love about this is that it's not used in a way to just set these creatures apart from what we're used to in this kind of thing. It's absolutely integral to every moment of the movie. Characters interact almost entirely through sign language, aside from times when they're either locked away in their soundproof bunker or are near a sound source that is louder than they are. This could have very easily felt like artificial set dressing, but I really appreciate the complete commitment to building the whole movie around this premise of the characters needing to be next to silent for the vast majority of the time. This silent approach isn't just limited to the character interactions though, because in a way, it's also present in how the movie tells its story. We don't dive into a ton of lore about this apocalypse, and we spend the whole movie with only this family for the most part. This is less about the apocalypse as it is exploring the themes of parenthood and sacrifice, so it's really not necessary to get into all the nitty-gritty details about that kind of thing. What we do get is delivered through really great environmental storytelling, like Lee's whiteboard with notes about the creatures or news clippings on the wall. One of the details that I really loved is that the characters navigate barefoot and on trails of sand that have been left behind to make sure that they're as quiet as possible, which to me immediately elevates the tension because it's showing just how careful they have to be about making noise in such a natural and immersive way. It's one thing to have the characters say, hey, we have to be quiet because otherwise the creatures will come. But it's another to just show how this world operates and let us piece it all together ourselves, and that results in a more tense feeling because it feels more believable. So many elements of the environments in this movie divulge a lot of really cool details about the adaptations people have made to survive this new world among these terrifying creatures. At least how this area has gone about it. As I said, we don't really meet anyone else, but it's established that the Abbott family isn't the only group holding up in the area. There's a moment early on that I absolutely love where they light a beacon and we see so many others come alight in the distance, which was a really heartwarming sign of solidarity among these people who've all been thrust into this terrifying situation. There is a really strong heart at the core of this movie that elevates it above just being an apocalyptic horror movie, but I'll get more into that in a bit because I want to talk about the Abbott family first. The opening of A Quiet Place is incredibly simple and straightforward, but It does so much in the way of setting up the rules of the world and the very high stakes of what happens if they aren't followed, while also establishing a really emotionally complex backstory that adds a ton of dimension to all the characters. It's seriously impressive. We pick up with the Abbott family scavenging for supplies, and their youngest kid, Bo, damn near gets them all killed when he's reaching for a toy rocket ship and it almost falls and hits the floor. Thankfully, his sister Reagan grabs it before that happens, and Lee has a very straight to the point talk with him about how they can't bring this toy along because it's too loud and they can't risk it. Side note, Reagan is played by Millicent Simmons, who Krasinski pushed for because he wanted the role of the deaf Reagan to be played by someone who is actually deaf. An ASL interpreter was brought on to make sure that communication could be as clear as possible, and Simmons played a big part in helping the rest of the cast to use sign language, which again is the primary method of communication in the movie. I love this because, of course, it adds a lot of authenticity to the character, but also because it makes me really happy to know that Krasinski was pushing for that kind of representation in the casting when the producers hadn't originally considered it. This kind of thing is really important, and Simmons absolutely kills it in this movie. Maybe that's not the best choice of words. Because she secretly gives Bo the rocket ship back without the batteries, and when she turns her back, he takes the batteries and puts them in, which leads him to getting killed by one of the creatures. I can see this playing out with the sound blasting, and then we get a close call with the kid dying, but having it actually happen does so much heavy lifting for the movie's stakes, but it also sets up a fantastic emotional dynamic inside the family. Of course, we now have a family that has lost one of their own. Lee and Evelyn are dealing with the death of their youngest child, and Reagan has lost her younger brother, something that she has a lot of guilt about because, well, she didn't give him the batteries for the rocket. She did give him the rocket ship, and he saw her sneakiness and took it a step further for himself. She was just trying to do a nice thing for her little brother and give him some youthful playfulness that every child should have, and it wound up getting him killed. The other side of this is that, while he doesn't say it and doesn't even fully seem like he's aware of it himself, Lee in some way holds a level of resentment for Reagan after what happened, which is fucking tragic. What makes this work though and feel so believable is that it's a plot point that's handled with a lot of nuance, where Lee's not just constantly pissy with Reagan or blaming her for anything, it's just this quiet thing simmering below the surface that shows its face in moments like Lee not wanting Reagan to come out into the wilderness with him and Marcus, and not really being able to come up with a proper answer for that when Marcus asks him why he didn't let her, and then goes on to say that he should tell Reagan that he loves her because she doesn't feel like he does anymore.
You still love her, right?
Of course I do.
You should tell her.
Oftentimes in movies, I think young characters are made to be too emotionally mature to be believable, but in the context of an apocalypse, this sort of thing makes a lot more sense, and it's a really potent moment where you can see that Lee doesn't even realize that he hasn't told Reagan he loves her in a long time. That's not to say that he doesn't, and we can see through his actions that of course Lee loves his daughter. He's been trying to build her a hearing aid that will be loud enough for her to get some of that sense, but the attempts have been fruitless to the point despite his efforts. The scene where he presents Reagan with a new design he's tried is absolutely heartbreaking because she seems to have completely given up on it and refuses to even let him try it on her, but it's also beautiful both because the care Lee's been putting into trying to help his daughter hear, but also because of how unrelenting he is with trying to help her not give up entirely. He loves his daughter, but that part of yourself you don't really have any control over is holding something against her with what happened, and that dissonance is really sad to watch because it's portrayed in such an understated and natural way. And this brings me to that heart at the core of the story that I mentioned. It's very easy to make a post-apocalyptic horror movie be super dreary and bleak, and that's often the case. This genre is laden with desaturated color palettes and dejected characters fighting for nothing in rotted worlds, but watching A Quiet Place has such a different feel from those, and not just from a narrative standpoint. This movie is absolutely beautiful visually, with bright fall trees and warm sunlight bathing this farmland that's been built up to be a proper home. Even though it's designed to be navigated under the circumstances of something horrible, it's such a cozy and welcoming looking place. These warm fairy lights covering the property do serve more of a purpose than just light, but they look so lovely. The interiors feel lived in and comforting, and the colors are highly saturated. Hell, this even extends to the wardrobe, with everyone wearing these really cozy sweaters that makes the aesthetic of the movie feel oddly warm and comforting when you consider how hostile the world has become. Figured I'd match them for today and put on my own cozy sweater, even though it's 20 degrees today. It's for the love of the game. You'd think that a world where people can't speak to each other without risking immediate and brutal death would be drained of its heart, but that's not the case. It only makes the moments when they get to speak freely all the more potent, like when Lee and Marcus are out fishing and Lee gets him to just yell at the top of his lungs behind the sound blanket of a waterfall, which is a primal freedom that's taken for granted that Marcus maybe has never experienced before based off his hesitance. One of my favorite moments of the entire movie is this scene between Lee and Evelyn in their soundproof surveillance and research basement where they share a wordless dance to one of the coziest songs you can slow dance to. Let's go out and feel the night. It's beautiful, and the movie lingers on these moments to let you relish in the warmth at the center of it all, painting this lovely picture of a family that absolutely has not lost hope or become divided even after so many horrible things have happened. It transforms what very easily could have been a bleak story into something a lot more optimistic, and it's done in a way that doesn't shove it all down your throat or over-explain it. It's made clear through the world-building, aesthetic, and scene structure. While the silence of the movie does a lot in building up these moments, it's also very effectively utilized to create tension, with one scene in particular being something that should be used as a benchmark for building suspense. It's not just that the characters are restricted from talking to one another or making loud noises. They have to be extremely careful in every moment to be as silent as they possibly can and make use of the natural sounds in the world to cover up their own. So what happens when someone goes into labor? One of the smartest possible things for a movie with this premise to do is to put the characters into a situation where loud noise is a near inevitability. And an even smarter thing to do is to have a newborn baby be involved with that. Having Evelyn go into labor as these creatures are narrowing in on the property and entering her house while Lee and Marcus are still out and Reagan ran off to be at the gravesite of Beau is something that just immediately sets off every possible red alarm I have at my disposal, and the sequence that follows of her realizing what's happening and trying to mentally prepare herself for this is unbelievably well executed. And if you want to learn how to craft a suspenseful scene that will have people on the edge of their seat, this is one of those scenes that you should be studying. A lot of the time, a threat that's causing suspense isn't guaranteed to pay off, and there's nothing wrong with that. A killer stalking around while someone is hiding might not find them, but that doesn't make it not suspenseful. The thing that works so well here is that while Evelyn does a damn good job at keeping herself quiet under the circumstances, we know that it's really a ticking time bomb for her to slip up because she's literally giving birth. And that inevitability is what cranks this up to a 10. Fate is being absolutely cruel to this poor woman because not only is she going into labor, but she also goes through one of the most cringe-inducing things any movie character can, and that's the please no, God, I hate it so much. Oh my God. I don't know why that nails there, but I hate it, and I hate the people who made the movie for showing me this. I hate it. Even rewatching this movie, there aren't many sequences I can remember sitting through recently that made me tense up in quite the same way as this one did, and made me so utterly aware of every little sound and movement in play throughout the scene. All the pieces come together wonderfully, and I'm always a sucker for stories that can execute moments where a bunch of different goings-on build up a Jenga tower that then collapses once all the pieces are in place. Evelyn being pregnant, Lee and Marcus being away from the homestead, and Reagan off at Beau's gravesite. And it all results in this fantastic scene that feels so well earned. Now, before I talk about the climax and conclusion, there's one thing that I need to talk about, and it's unfortunately something that really puts a damper on this experience. With a story that restricts actual dialogue to a very select few scenes, the soundscape becomes even more important than it is in most movies because it's most of what we get in terms of audio. The sound design itself is absolutely fantastic, and I'm talking about things like the diegetic audio. The flowing rivers and waterfalls, wispy grass and trees, and the way the movie becomes heavily muffled and nearly dead silent when we're experiencing a scene through Reagan's perspective. That sort of thing is used wonderfully, like the scene when she decides to try out Lee's latest attempt at a hearing aid, and we're hoping that we'll hear the snap of her fingers. When it doesn't come, you really feel it because the soundscape is committing to her point of view. It's an incredibly emotional moment that's elevated by the really thoughtful sound design. You're forced to immerse yourself in the auditory side of this story since it's such an integral part of it, and you'll become acutely aware of what the environment sounds like. Then we have the noises that the creatures make, which are really creepy and make them feel very insectile. None of that is the problem. The issue is that the vast majority of the score for A Quiet Place is so uninteresting and generic, save for one standout track that I liked. The quieter and more reflective music is genuinely beautiful, but during the scenes of suspense and the more action-oriented moments, all we have is just really bland and trite horror music that is such a huge hit on the movie, especially when most of the presentation here is handled with so much care. Bland music is something that will always get on my nerves, but when it's a movie that forces me to immerse myself in the soundscape as intimately as this one does, something that would be a short point of criticism is turned into a huge blemish that properly holds the movie back from fully achieving its vision. It's not something that's a throwaway complaint in this context. It's really frustrating because I feel like the movie had this glass ceiling keeping it down. The score was done by Marco Beltrami, and I'm not hating on the dude because there are some solid tracks here. And it's not that he's a bad composer, it's that a movie like this needs a far more distinct and cohesive and atmospheric score in order to be fully realized, and having most of the music be a very by-the-numbers horror score is a shame. Again, no hate to Marco, I just don't think the score here complements the movie's premise or presentation in most cases, and because sound is so important, it's something that has a very noticeable effect on the feel of the movie. Alright, well, with that bummer out of the way, let's talk about the final act of A Quiet Place. So we get to see some of the defenses that this family has set up on the farmhouse as Evelyn switched the lights to red, which indicates to Marcus and Lee that she's in danger when they return. And we also see that they have a fireworks display set up as a sound distraction, which is thankfully triggered as Evelyn is giving birth. Now, I will say that there is a fair amount of just go with us here with how little the baby is crying, because realistically, this would be a much worse situation than it is. I do wish that they'd done more with that issue than they do, because it basically comes down to them just being lucky and not having the baby cry at inopportune moments. It does become harder to believe at times, which can drain some of the tension, but it's nothing that kills the movie. Evelyn is such a fucking badass in here, and watching her be so close to death so frequently in order to protect her baby is really intense. The big theme at the core of this movie is the willingness a parent has to sacrifice themselves for the well-being of their children, which is something that's apparent throughout the whole thing, but it all comes to a head in a moment that is so deeply beautiful and equally tragic, where Marcus and Reagan are held up in a truck, and Marcus accidentally alerts one of the creatures to their presence, and Lee is forced to make the ultimate sacrifice to save his kids. The thing that makes this moment a real tearjerker is the final thing he decides to say to Reagan. The one thing that she needed to hear from him, that she didn't believe anymore and he didn't know he was neglecting. And he sends her off with the last sight of her father being that show of love that was held by a brick wall after what happened at the start of the movie. Again, bringing it back to the core of this movie being so warm. It's these moments that feel like they really tie the whole movie together with this beautiful thematic through line and give so much purpose to the movie's premise beyond its obvious horror potential. So Lee made the ultimate sacrifice and saves his kids, and in one last beautiful moment, Reagan realizes something about the hearing aids that he was working on. They may not have helped in what Lee built them to do, but they can cause a feedback loop that is so painful to the incredibly sensitive ears of the creatures that it can put them out of commission. So while his work was never for nothing because it was something he was doing out of love for his daughter, now these have a more direct use, meaning he can continue to protect his family even after he's gone. There is a lot of sadness in this scene, but it's also a really wonderful way to show how the things we don't realize people contribute to our lives are meaningful until they're not around to provide them anymore. Good God, I love how well this story is told. Well, a shotgun blast from Evelyn was certainly loud enough to draw in a lot more of these things, but with this new discovery of the feedback loops and Evelyn wielding a pump-action shotgun like she wasn't already the coolest, the movie ends on a very optimistic note that shows how this family will continue to persevere in the face of all this horror and tragedy. I do think I would have preferred a more subdued final moment to the film, since a lot of the third act's thematic material is very introspective, but I also like the bombastic and aggressive conclusion that's showing that they're gonna keep fighting. A Quiet Place is one of the best horror movies that came out in the 2010s. I have absolutely no qualms with saying that. It's a very tight and effective story that uses its platform to beautifully tell a narrative that's woven through every aspect of the presentation, evoking such a heartwarming feeling that makes the movie feel so optimistic and beautiful in spite of all the horror of the world that's being occupied. This family unit is so emotionally impactful and well realized, and the fantastic performances all around make it feel natural, which elevates everything further. Moments like Lee and Evelyn dancing in the basement damn near put me to tears. It's just so much more than a standard apocalypse story. It's just a deeply human narrative, and that's what makes it work so well. Aside from the score and some of the suspension of disbelief towards the end, this movie is absolutely stellar, and those things aren't enough to keep it from leaving the emotional impact that it does. It's also tense as all hell, with one of the most suspenseful sequences I've seen in a long time, and really intimidating and unique creatures in an apocalyptic setting. I love this movie. I'm so glad I revisited it, and it's one that I'll continue to rewatch over and over again for how well it executes this beautiful story, keeps things short and sweet, never dragging or feeling anywhere near being bloated. All that being said, I've never actually seen the second one, and I'll be taking a look at that very soon before the prequel drops later in June. Until then, thank you for stopping by Rocklin Graves. I hope you've enjoyed your stay.